What I want to talk about here today is a few things. A brief overview of Hendra virus, and I'm going to jump through the first slides a bit ad hoc to cover things and look at that, the sources of entry into a feedlot, which is really where we get down to the relevance to the audience here. The impacts of an outbreak on a feedlot, strategies for Hendra virus management. Now I'll cover that very briefly. There's only really two main options from my point of view that are suitable to the industry, and what I really hope is out of this whole process is it starts a starting point for further conversation. We can go away and have an ordered, meaningful discussion about this topic and how, as an industry, we're going to move forward and manage it. Okay, so very briefly, most people have a basic understanding of Hendra virus. It requires flying foxes and bats. Screen through that. So if we get our bat droppings, contaminated food and stuff containing the virus from an infected bat, we then go and get pasture contamination or feed contamination. The virus is pretty stable. It can survive for 4 days in the environment under the right conditions. We get ingestion and we get an infected horse. Now that's natural infection, that's bat to horse, okay? Now this slide's pretty key to what I need to talk to you guys about today. We get infection, a natural infection we're talking about here, whereby we get infection, then we've got a period of time between the horse is infected and when it actually either shows signs of disease or we've got some way of testing that horse has been infected. It's actually excreting virus. So we've got infection, we've then got our pre-patent period, which is variable, and it can be over 2 weeks before the horse does anything abnormal. And the first thing it's going to do is actually start excreting the virus. So it is actually contagious prior to that horse being sick. Now that's a pretty key point, that we've got a period of time there we've got a clinically normal horse that's contagious before it shows clinical signs. Once it shows clinical signs, the disease course is very short. It only lasts a couple of days. It's a very fatal disease, 75% fatality rate, which makes it pretty bloody high. And 75% die, the remaining 25% are euthanized because they prevent a public health risk. Okay. Now where the Hendra virus has been, now this is a time-lapse slide showing the cases from 1994 up till now. The background is where the seropositive bats are in Australia, so it's where we can actually go test a bat colony and detect Hendra virus in it. Now, the amount of bats varies, but it varies between 20% and 60%, which is quite a substantial number of bats. Now, we were pretty good until 2008, whereby we had a massive increase in the amount of Hendra virus. 2008 being the Redlands Bay, where a vet clinic itself got infected. And these last 3 years in different colours really show the extent of the issue we're dealing with. Now, you can see from that the cases themselves have been mainly down the eastern seaboard. They're throughout that entire area of where seropositive bats actually occur. West of the Great Dividing Range, near the top of Queensland down into New South Wales. Now, I'm no expert in the field I'm a horse vet, I'm not really that associated with the feedlot industry, but if I had to shade that map where most of the feedlots are, I'd say that would cover at least half of them. And you guys are geographically exposed to Hendra virus. It is present in the area that you guys live and work, okay? So a key point from here is that there's two ways, not just one, that Hendra virus can enter a feedlot. The first is natural infection that we were talking about before, whereby a horse is exposed to a bat and gets sick. So that's occurring at the feedlot. Now, the levels of biosecurity control in the lot feeding industry are very good. They're very good at protecting natural infection. Where we have an issue and a potential threat is the concept of a secondary infection. An infected horse getting exposed somewhere else and contracting Hendra virus and coming in with Hendra virus without any clinical signs or any way of testing that horse and proving that it has Hendra virus. So the horse enters the feedlot without showing clinical signs of infection, okay? So that's where infection's occurring away from the feedlot and you're bringing the horse in, okay? Now, without going through what we do with a sick horse at the moment, there's a lot I can go into there. Basically, we get to a point with any sick horse that's showing non-specific clinical signs, we do a Hendra test, 48-hour turnaround. Generally, the DPI is very good at that. There's some issues with weekends and other factors, but if that test result is negative, life goes on. It's not really much of an issue, and that's the majority of the times. What I'm focusing on is the what if we do get a positive test at a feedlot. Now, Hendra virus is a notifiable disease. We take this thing pretty seriously. biosecurity or quarantine the facility. All in-contact horses, in fact all in-contact animals, need to be sampled. The infected horse is obviously euthanized. Okay? So the impact on the feedlot is important regarding this quarantine. So the feedlot is likely to be placed under full quarantine, and I'm at the bottom end of the pecking order. Some of these issues need clarification, obviously, but at the moment, the feedlot would be placed under full quarantine, and yes, this is likely to include all the cattle for a minimum of 32 days. Why the cattle? Well, we already know that horses can infect other species apart from just other horses and humans. You know, there's been a bit of media about the dogs that have been euthanized. And there is no solid proof that cattle cannot be infected. In fact, there is substantial argument to be made that if we went and tested cattle to see if they're susceptible to Hendra virus, there is a substantial argument that we said that we could end up proving that cattle can be infected with Hendra virus, and then we do really have an issue, okay? So the major issues, I guess, to summarise, because I am running out of time, sorry Esther, we've got exposure to employees to a potentially fatal virus, and this opens a whole can of worms. Hendra is now a preventable disease, so there's occupational health and safety issues. There's loss of livestock and the consequences of the quarantine that I was talking about. So there is substantial business impact for an individual business. Now, I don't know a lot of feedlots that are really going to tolerate a 32-day quarantine particularly well at the present point in time. Now, I know the following two questions are a bit speculative, but if I can ask these questions, I'm sure someone else from outside the industry can raise the same issues. And certainly, in the past, we've seen that in disease outbreaks, science, common sense, things like that tend to take a back seat and panic ensues. So would Hendra virus raise a question of food safety? And would an outbreak affect our beef export industry? However temporarily, but there are some significant industry impacts that can potentially result from a Hendra positive horse on a feedlot, okay? So we've got two options for management. Biosecurity. So biosecurity is very good at reducing the risk of natural infection. It doesn't prevent it. We've been doing biosecurity for 10 years and we still get Hendra cases. To put a biosecurity protocol in place to prevent secondary infection requires a lot of things, but for a start, it would require strict quarantine of all horses entering a facility, preferably prior to them coming in, for greater than 16 days, so that we can and in that process we need to stop all access to natural infections, basically stable them and reduce that risk, and stop any exposure to any other horses outside before they come in, and that is a very, very hard ask. The other, so what we're trying to achieve is trying to stop horses coming in that pre-patent period, okay? So the other tool we have obviously now is vaccination, which I'm happy to field 10 million questions on this issue afterwards. I'm around all this evening. So it's aimed at preventing introduction of an infected horse into the feedlot, and it's aimed at preventing both natural and secondary infection, obviously. It's the most effective tool we have to stop the cycle of Hendra virus through horses to other species. Okay? So to finish up, I've got four main questions for the industry itself to go away and have a think about. But what are the occupational health and safety issues of the business in protecting employees? What effects will a quarantine have on a feedlot, on the individual business? Do we need to adopt an industry-wide recommendations? I hate making, people ask me, should vaccination be compulsory? No, I think common sense should dictate and let people choose what they want to do. But do we need to have an industry-wide recommendation to protect the industry itself? And what is the most effective management strategy on an individual basis and an industry basis? So I got done, Esther. So yeah, that's all I've got to say, and I'm more than happy to talk about this later on this evening, because that raises a whole can of worms, I guess.
Yeah, thanks very much, Joe. I think that was a great presentation. It was exactly what we needed. I think probably not necessarily a question, but a statement, and I think you raised some really good and pertinent points towards the end of your presentation there in terms of what industry should be doing. I thought I'd just briefly comment from an alpha perspective, because certainly we've seen this issue coming over the hill at a rate of knots, and we've recognised that we absolutely need to undertake some of those actions. So From an alpha point of view, what we have done is we've written to state and federal governments seeking subsidy assistance for the cost of vaccines for Hendra. At this stage, we've got a response back from the federal government which basically says they've contributed to the development of the vaccine but are not prepared to contribute any more in terms of subsidising the actual cost. We're not going to leave it there, of course. We're pursuing state level and also with Zoetis, so we'll see how we go on that front. In terms of some of the other biosecurity comments, we're looking very closely at that as well, and both from a national feedlot accreditation scheme perspective and also providing industry advice and guidance. So I just thought I'd make a couple of those comments just to let everyone know that certainly very cognisant of the issue and we're on the case.